A Mediterranean Mystery by Fred E. Wynne. Chapter 7. I Mount a Camel. By the next morning the coast was more distinct and we were still approaching it. But our progress was now very slow and we could depend only on the land breeze of early morning and the sea breeze of the evening. The heat of the day was tremendous, or seemed so to me, even under the awnings which were rigged fore and aft and kept constantly wet. Metal work on deck became too hot to touch, and even the painted wooden bulwarks burned through one's sleeves when leaned upon. The Arabs worked unwillingly, dropping down and sleeping in any patch of shade that presented itself, and I constantly heard the horrid swish of Jacob's whip as he woke them. I spent the long, intolerable days dripping in a hammock chair on deck, feverishly watching the sweep of the sun across the sky and calculating the hours to be endured before he would again become red and harmless in the healing vapours of the western horizon, and the sea breeze would surprise me again with its chilliness. Or I gazed with aching eyes at the palpitating sand of the coast, wondering if it would be possible for me to live and move on it at all. Edmund and Welfare had the acquired Eastern habit of sleeping during the hot hours, and spent most of the time in their cabins when they were not required on deck. At that blessed hour before sunset, however, we met on deck, and Hassan brought up ingeniously cooled drinks for the party. It was on one of these occasions that I expressed my fears as to the heat of the desert journey. "It won't be as bad as this, really," Edmund said. "We will land you in the evening when Jacob has got the camels together and loaded. You will travel through the night and make for a place where you can spend the day under shelter. Then it will be only one trek of a few hours to the nearest station on the railway. I've never been on that Western Railway, but I'm afraid they are fairly rotten old carriages. If you get a day train, it will be beastly hot and dusty. 5 or 6 hours will get you into Alexandria." That certainly does not sound alarming. I had a twinge of something like disappointment at the idea of my adventure dwindling to such modest dimensions. Once it was over, I should have liked to tell people at the Athenaeum and other comfortable places at home about the long trek on camelback across the burning sands. I would have welcomed quite a considerable degree of real discomfort as a basis for exaggeration within the limits proper to a clergyman. "I shouldn't mind trying a part of the journey in the daytime," I said. "Perhaps not," said Captain Welfare, "but the natives won't allow their camels to work in the heat." "I thought a camel could stand any amount of heat." "Not them. They are the softest beasts that walk. They drop in their tracks in the heat, and if it's cold at night they have to be rugged up better than a horse." "There is more rot believed by people at home about camels," said Edmund, "than about any beast of the field. What do you suppose is a camel's load?" I confess my ideas are very vague. I couldn't tell you to a ton. They both laughed. "I think it's the natural history books that are given as Sunday school prizes that are responsible for the average Englishman's ideas about camels. Their proper load for regular work is 300 lbs. Of course they can take more for a short time. The natives overload them badly themselves, but they won't let us when we hire them. You bet they watch that. And he's got to be watered every second day to keep his condition, not about once a week as people imagine. As his pace is 2.5 miles an hour, a horse can really get just as far between drinks. All the same, he's a most invaluable beast. We could do nothing without him on the desert. Oh, you will get to like them all right when you're used to them." As a matter of fact, now that the time was getting so near, I began to have qualms of uneasiness at the idea of riding on one of these uncouth beasts. I like riding my own familiar cob, but am somewhat nervous of mounting even a strange horse, and to me a camel had never been anything but an object placed for my amusement and instruction in the zoological garden. There he had always amused and instructed me from the other side of a tall and impregnable iron fence. I knew, of course, that trippers in Egypt always got photographed mounted on a camel with the Sphinx and a pyramid in the background, as if all the tripping in Egypt were done on camelback and they had not in fact gone from Cairo to Giza in an electric tramcar. But I now reflected that these were doubtless special camels kept for the purpose, broken, as it were, to trippers, heartbroken, no doubt. But to have to mount and control the ordinary camel of Arab commerce, picked up by Jacob on a wild and inaccessible part of the desert, I felt might be a very different proposition, and one making a heavy demand on the courage of a middle-aged and naturally timid vicar. "I hope," I said, "I shall be able to ride the beast all right." "Oh, you will manage that easily," Edmund said. "They are perfectly quiet. We will show you how to mount, and after he gets up you have only to sit there and oscillate." It sounded quite simple, and yet there were vague misgivings left in my heart. "How many camels are we taking?" I asked. "Well, we've roughly 2,000 lbs of stuff. That will take 6 baggage camels. 4 could do it for such a short journey, but the natives are sure to insist on our hiring 6. Then there will be a riding camel for you and one for Yakub. By the way, what is this merchandise I'm shepherding?" I asked. "We will have to explain all that," said Edmund, cutting in as Welfare rubbed his great chin thoughtfully. "We've got to give you a lot of rather elaborate directions. I suppose we might as well do it now as later." "Yes," added Captain Welfare, "the whole thing is a rather delicate business. If it's not worked right, we would spoil our own markets, and you see we can't let Jacob know too much." "I'm very glad to hear that," I said. "You must not tell him anything," said Welfare, "though he has to hand the stuff over to our agent, and even that has to be done quietly. The stuff is, well, it's a kind of chemical. It's one of the rare earths used in making incandescent gas mantles. There's hardly any of it in Egypt, and there's tremendous competition to get it. That's why if it was known as we had brought in such a big lot as 2,000 lbs, the price would go flop and we would lose a lot of money. I say, this really did seem to me an obvious and easily comprehensible proposition. "And so," said Edmund, taking up the argument, "we want you to take it into Alexandria as curios, and specimens and things you have collected in the deserts. That is, if you're asked any questions, which you probably won't be." I could feel their eyes upon me as I took in their suggestion that I should become a party to what certainly seemed to me a transaction very near akin to fraud. I was amused to feel that they both expected me to be much more shocked than in fact I was. As long as I was satisfied that nobody was going to be injured or defrauded, the mere verbal inexactitude was to me only a harmless breach of one of those conventions which, as I have already explained, I regard as maintained for the guidance of persons of inferior intellect. This attitude of mine may seem rather shocking to some quite intelligent people. I suppose it represents the effect on me of my theological training. "Don't you think," I asked after a rather pregnant pause, "that my position would be a somewhat uncomfortable one if it were discovered that my desert collections consisted entirely of rare earth for incandescent mantles?" "It would," Edmund admitted, "but there's not the slightest risk of that happening. Do you think I would ask you to do it if there were?" "Honestly, Edmund, it is becoming difficult for me to estimate the limits of your possible requests." Edmund smiled gaily with a look of relief, but Captain Welfare still watched me, leaning forward with his hairy hands on his knees and an expression of anxious solicitude in his large pathetic eyes. If you like, sir, he suggested, we could easily put in a layer of shells and fossils and native ornaments, things a clergyman would pick up on the desert. No, thank you, I said snappishly. There's not the remotest fear of anyone wanting to examine the cases or asking any questions as long as they are under your charge. I merely suggested you should yourself say they were your collections or whatever you like to call them when putting them on the railway. I have worked it all out. Now, listen, we put you ashore at a quiet spot on Egyptian territory. If the stuff were dutiable, that would of course be smuggling. Certainly, if we landed at Alexandria, the customs people would examine it, and we have told you why we don't want it known that we have brought the stuff into Egypt. The camel men won't bother as long as they are paid about double the proper price for their camels, and at the station, for 100 piastres bakshish, you will have both station master and guard ready to shine your boots with their tongues. At Alexandria, you will go straight to von Ermengen's hotel. He knows all about the consignments, and Jacob will follow you with the cases as soon as he is able to get a vehicle to put them in. Then you will hand them over to our agent in Alexandria, who will call for them with a note signed by us, which you will have posted yourself in Alexandria. Then you will have finished with the business, and Jacob will get back to us if he can, and go to the devil if he can't. As thus stated by Edmund, the proposition seemed to me quite a harmless ruse de guerre. I was suspicious of all commercial methods, and nothing would have induced me, for instance, to cooperate in anything like the trading habits of our grocer, who was nevertheless, as I have already mentioned, one of the most eminent members of my Sunday congregation. But I saw nothing in this transaction to which anyone could object who kept his conscience in reasonable subjection, and I said so frankly. Captain Welfare's tension immediately relaxed. He leaned back in his chair with a sigh and wiped his forehead and upper lip with his handkerchief. As the evening was now cool and no amount of heat ever seemed able to make Captain Welfare perspire, this was a sure indication that he had been in a condition of considerable mental agitation. He drew a long breath, and I saw at once that he was under the necessity of making a speech. This happened to him sometimes, just as other men get periodical attacks of asthma or gallstones. Mr. Davron, sir, he began, after clearing his throat in the most approved oratorical style, I think this is the third time, as we have had to put before you a proposition that must have seemed distasteful to you. A proposition you might have been justified in refusing without examination, if so be you had been a man as is not prepared to look into things and do the square thing and the kind thing and the generous thing. How stow it, Welfare, said Edmund. But Captain Welfare was not to be stopped now, any more than a body of stampeded mules. He ignored Edmund, who stretched out his legs, shut his eyes, and pretended to go to sleep. I want to put it on record, sir, as we appreciate the handsome way you have met us on these occasions. You have acted as a gentleman, sir, because you're a gentleman, and as a man because, well, because you're a man. There was a prolonged groan from Edmund. I wish to thank you, sir, for the spirit in which you have met all our suggestions. I felt extremely embarrassed. The Astarte lay becalmed and almost motionless between the still glowing desert shore and the vast disk of the sun, now falling through a mass of slate-colored vapor to his setting. In all this golden and purple immensity, there was no living thing in sight outside the ship, which was suspended like a fragment of dust in a sunbeam. The only human sound was Captain Welfare's egregious claptrap. He was talking away exactly as if he were moving a vote of thanks to the chairman of a board of guardians or a town council, or proposing a toast at an Oddfellows supper. He was in that state of orgasm which oratory of this type always produces in the lower middle class Englishman. This habit is ridiculous enough, even among its normal surroundings of stuffy rooms, half cleared tables, and black coated pork butchers and pawnbrokers. But here, poised in the silence where sea and sky and desert met, where nature seemed to have unveiled her immensity in a sacramental moment, Captain Welfare ceased to be absurd. Edmund and I both felt him as something almost obscene, a sacrilege. I managed to murmur, "Thank you," when he finished, and I was indeed thankful for silence when it came. But grateful as the silence was, it seemed necessary to say something, if only to prevent the discovery by Welfare that he had not the sympathy of his audience, and so the development among us of embarrassment and discomfort. I asked him how long he thought it would be before he reached the landing place. "We are close to it now," he said. "Not about 30 miles or so, but of course we are at the mercy of the winds and the current." "The current?" I asked. "I thought there was practically no tide in the Mediterranean." "No, there's no tide to speak of, but coastal currents? My word, you pick up a point ashore and see how we are drifting now." Distant as the coast was, I could see that we were indeed slipping slowly back on the way we had come. The worst of these currents is that you can't reckon on them like the tide. They are wind driven or caused by heat, I suppose, but when you're ashore, don't you go bathing on this coast without you know where you are? There's often a 4 knot current inshore that would sweep any man away, and often does. But if we get a breeze tonight, we ought to land you tomorrow." As he spoke, the last limb of the sun sank below the horizon, lighting it for a moment with the mysterious green flash that is sometimes seen in these waters, and is said to be due to its rays shining through and illuminating the water at the edge of the sea. At the same time the sea, which had looked like a bath of mercury, suddenly blackened to northward of us, and the Astarte's booms swung out to starboard with the cheery rattle of sheets running through the blocks. The ship leaned over with a little thrill as of a happy awakening. The ripple began to play again at her bow, and we were under way once more. "That's better," said Captain Welfare, rising from his chair. "Would you like to see just where we are on the chart?" I thanked him, and we all three went below to his cabin. A section of an Admiralty chart was pinned out as usual, with the Astarte's position from day to day marked on it in pencil. Captain Welfare put a broad forefinger close to the last mark. "That's where we are now," he said, "as near as we can tell from soundings. As you see yourself, there's no landmarks anyone could pick up hereabouts. Those figures show you it's all shoal water between us and the land until we get here." He indicated a place a little further east along the coast where there was a small bay or indentation. "Here you see there's water enough for the Astarte up to within a few yards of the beach, and there's some tall sandhills and a bit of an old ruined sheikh's tomb that we can pick up even at night with this moon." "Yes, but are there any human beings or camels there?" Edmund laughed. "I think," he said, "you still suspect us of some ill doings. Do you really think we are going to maroon you on a waterless desert with a single cutthroat for companion?" "Don't be an ass, Edmund, but if you know anything about the business, tell me how we are going to get camels here." From the Arabs, said Captain Welfare. There is a tribe of them always in camp at this time of year a little inland of where we are going to land you. At least so Jacob says, and he knows the district. They will be getting in their barley crop now. They do some camel breeding here too. Jacob says he is sure to find them here, because the calves will be still too young to go on trek. You will see now, Mr. Devron, how we are bound to depend on Jacob in a business like this is. I suppose it would be impossible, I suggested, to find an Arab with Jacob's knowledge who was not also a scoundrel. I don't believe, said Welfare solemnly, that such a man exists. A straight man couldn't know all Jacob knows. This remark silenced me. I had so often myself observed this inverse ratio between knowledge and virtue. At dinner that evening I was somewhat oppressed by the feeling that it was probably my last night on the Astarte. We had been such good friends on board. The little cabin had come to look so familiar and so homelike to me. The whole experience had been so strange and withal so delightful to me that I could not but feel saddened at the thought of leaving it all. Instinctively, I shrank a little from the unknown and solitary experiences that awaited me in a strange land. I knew, too, that I would be missed, if only because three are much better company than two, where men are concerned at all events. Without conceit, I knew I should be missed in a much deeper sense than that. I am one of those insignificant but cornerless people who make a good third in such close quarters as ours were, and I was conscious that Edmund and Captain Welfare liked each other the better for my presence. Captain Welfare openly expressed his regret at my impending departure, and it required some skilled manoeuvring on the part of Edmund and myself to head him away from another speech. "By the way," I said, "you have forgotten to tell me what your plans are after you leave me, and when we are to meet again." "How, we will pick you up in Alexandria in a few days," said Edmund. "We will see you off home, unless you make up your mind to continue the cruise." "I wish that were possible," I said regretfully, "but it isn't." "When we put you ashore, sir," said Captain Welfare, "we will get out to sea as best we can, and get in the regular track of boats bound to Alexandria. If the police are on the lookout for Jacob, they will board us either there or when we are signalled at the harbour. I only wish you knew as much about the Gypsy police as we do, and could enjoy the laugh same as we will." There was an unusual vindictiveness in Captain Welfare's tone that made me wonder for a moment what were the experiences that had so prejudiced him against this branch of the public service. But this was not a time for uncharitable thoughts, and I put this one aside. "By the way," Edmund said, "we will have to look you out some clothes. I presume you didn't bring any tropical kit?" "No," I told him. "Bates fixed me up with these blue serge things and several pairs of white flannel trousers, most of which I am afraid I have soiled. He has also included a complete clerical rig out, without which he never allows me to travel." "Good," said Edmund. "You have got some dog collars, then. Bates is a pearl of great price. That is the only thing that was worrying me." "He has packed some clerical collars and a stock, if that's what you mean." "What on earth is a stock?" Edmund asked. "It is the black silk thing below what you call a dog collar. The two combined are the symbol of the apostolic succession. A stud, or a buttonhole in French, is a split, the stigma of schism. It is commonly associated with a white tie, an arrogant assumption of individual blamelessness, only possible in a heretic." "Well now, that's something I never understood before," said Captain Welfare. "You mean a church parson isn't better than another man, or don't reckon to be, outside of his official position, out of his uniform, hey?" "I don't know that I meant all that," I said, rather taken aback by this literal interpretation of my frivolous talk. I'm not much of a theologian, but I think what you say is something very like the Anglican idea. Well, I like it, he said. I've known preachers at home as has worn the biggest kind of white ties, and it's some of their ways as has stuck in my gizzard and made me the backslider I am. Mr. Davron, when I get ashore, I would like to join your church. I would take it kindly if you would baptize me, sir. I said I should be delighted. I did not see what else I could say under the circumstances, although I have a rooted objection to proselytes of every description. The question is, said Edmund impatiently, whether welfare's drill kits or mine would fit you best. We've both got plenty of clean spare suits, and I can rig you up with a pith helmet. I was only worried about the collar. You won't want one in the desert, but it's rather important you should turn up in Alexandria in clerical kit. I can manage that all right, I said indifferently. I suppose my own clothes would be too warm? Much too warm. You couldn't stand them. Edmund spoke decisively, and I sighed, for I dislike wearing clothes that have not been made for me. Edmund is 2 inches taller than me, and of late I have shown distinct signs of what my father used to call the elderly spread. On the other hand, Captain Welfare, though about my own height, is immensely larger in all his other dimensions. There is, however, fortunately, a remarkable flexibility about men's clothes, and I was able to pick out a couple of suits which I could wear with comfort and without loss of self-respect. Indeed, I can say more than that. So persistent is human vanity that I found myself admiring my own appearance in the clean white drill. It gave me, I thought, a look of youth and distinction to which I imagined I had long since renounced all claims. Edmund caught me in front of the mirror, deciding on the most becoming tilt of the pith helmet. This persistence of the peacock in one's nature is very disturbing. I was woken very early in the morning by a rattle which shook the whole ship. I started up and realized that it was the anchor chain running out. My long journey in the Astarte was at an end. I went straight on deck and saw the deserts close to me for the first time. The sun had not yet risen, but the dawn was foretold by a lilac glow in the east, where Venus still shone illustrious as a morning star. The Astarte was at anchor in a little cove, evidently the one I had been shown on the chart, for on my left I could see in the twilight the tall sandhills mentioned by Welfare. They were strangely carved by the wind to sharp, delicately curved edges with a surpassing beauty of line. Beside them, on a lower level, rose the little rounded dome of the Sheikh's tomb, over which leaned a single tall crooked date palm. Away to the right of this, the sand stretched to the horizon in wave after wave, yellow and silver in the faint light, with violet shadows between the vast undulations, and a few black patches of camel scrub here and there. The wind had almost gone. It ruffled the sea outside to a dark grey, but around us in the little bay the water lay silent, polished and opalescent under the growing dawn. The dinghy was already being rowed ashore, and I recognized Jacob's back, sitting crouched like a bird of prey in the stern sheets. The crew were busy getting the sails off the ship and stowing them. They worked quickly and in a strange, uncanny silence. Edmund and Captain Welfare were both on deck, already dressed. They stood together watching the crew and speaking almost in whispers, with an unwonted look of anxiety on their faces. Captain Welfare kept searching the shore with his telescope. Very soon I saw the morning star fade out in a red glare that filled the east, and then the sun came up, climbing swiftly from the horizon. For a moment the desert sparkled with the lustre of jewelry, then the effect passed, and its surface settled into the burning yellow and white of the common light of day. But the smooth, shallow sea of the desert's margin turned from the pearly opalescence of the dawn to a glory of blue such as I had never imagined. It was not the blue of the sea or sky, but the incredible blue of a butterfly's wing. It brought to my mind childhood's dream pictures of the glory of the river that flows round the throne of God, and my heart ached with the splendor of it. The sun came as a tyrant. It seemed to take but a few moments before he was clear of the vapor of the horizon, and the heat of the day had begun. I went below to my cabin. I dressed myself and sorrowfully bestowed what I needed for my journey in a hold-all. The hot day seemed intolerably long. I lay on deck trying in vain to read. Their manifest anxiety kept Edmund and Welfare in an irritable silence. The cases I was to take with me were brought on deck. They were roped and sealed, and the word Antikas was painted on the outside in large black letters, with some Arabic characters below, which I took to be a translation of this lie. The boat was lowered, and they were stowed in it with my hold-all, and all brought ashore and laid on the beach. There was nothing more to do, and by 4 o'clock our nervous tension was becoming almost unbearable when the sandy skyline was broken by the tall silhouette of a camel with a man mounted on it advancing majestically towards us. Captain Welfare had a long look at him through the glass. "Thank God," he said. "It's Jacob, all right. The others must be following him." Jacob put his camel into a trot and came rapidly down to the beach. I watched with anticipatory dread the process of making the camel kneel, or, as it seemed to me, fold itself up. Jacob sprang lightly off and tied the animal's nose rope round one of its knees to secure it. The camel stretched its long neck along the ground and began nosing in the sand for something eatable. Jacob came out in the dinghy and was aboard in a few minutes. Captain Welfare met him and coming aft announced, with a look of relief, that the baggage camels and one for me were only a mile or so behind Jacob. "We're lucky," he said, "for I think there is a land breeze coming up, and the sooner we are out of this the better. I only hope for your sake, Mr. Devon, it isn't a camp scene. I would be sorry if you made the acquaintance of the desert in a sandstorm." I went below to finish my packing. Hassan showed me with pride the hamper of provisions and wines he had provided for the journey, together with two great water jars. When I came back on deck, rather self-conscious in my white suit and helmet, I saw the camels crouching on the beach, and heard with dread their deep guttural grumblings and threatenings as their loads were roped onto them. But what surprised me most of all was the sudden appearance among us of a stranger. This was a young clean-shaved Egyptian of the middle class, dressed in a suit of drab linen with a tarbouch on his head. Edmund laughed as he came up to us with an obsequious salaam. "Let me introduce you to your dragoman," he said. Then as the man looked up with a smile of insufferable insolence, I saw that it was Jacob. He was not merely disguised by clothes, it was the total change of the consummate artist. It seemed that he was another man. He had deliberately revealed himself by his smile, and when that faded from his face it was impossible even to think of him as Jacob, utterly impossible to recognize him. Edmund drew me aside. "You're not in the least likely to want this," he said, "but you never know. You had better have it in case." He gave me a revolver which I had unwillingly to put in my pocket. It seemed an enormous size and weight, and I always have a feeling that these things go off of themselves. Still, when I thought of Yakub, I was glad to have it. "Here's another dozen rounds," said Edmund. "You can give me the lot back in Alexandria." The crew were already busy making sail under Welfare's directions. I said goodbye to him with great regret. Edmund came ashore with me in the dinghy. I looked back and said, "Do you know this is the first time I have seen the Astarte from outside?" "So it is," said Edmund. "Well, she's pretty, isn't she?" She looked very beautiful lying there, idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean, her lines aspiring to the tall pointed bows on the noble length of her bowsprit, her tall pointed sails drooping gracefully to their own reflection in the water. "I'm very, very sorry to leave her," I said. "I hope," said Edmund gravely, "that whatever happens you will always keep a kindly feeling for her in your heart." Edmund led me up to my camel. The brute slewed its head round and eyed us with a supercilious and malevolent expression that reminded me of Jacob. It kept its mouth open, ready to protest against whatever was done to it, showing a great bunch of teeth in its lower jaw. As we approached it made a noise as if it were gargling its throat. "All you have to do," said Edmund, "is to nib on to the saddle quickly and hang on to this wooden upright. He will start getting up the minute you're on, and that throws you about a bit, but once he is on his feet you will be all right and quite comfortable. Cross your feet over his left shoulder and hold on to the upright at first till you're used to the motion. Keep him in a sort of half trot if you can. It's less tiring than walking, but he will follow Jacob's beast anyhow. What am I to do if he runs away? He won't do that. He will keep in the string all right." I watched Jacob mount, and with a great effort of will power followed his example. I stretched one leg over the brute, and was pulling myself into my seat to an accompaniment of appalling growls, when an earthquake seemed to take place. I was flung forward, then backwards and forwards again, and shot up skywards at the same time, but remained safe on the bundle of mats they called a saddle. I found myself at a dizzy height, with the camel's greyish white neck stretched out a long way below me, and a single slender rope in my hand to guide him with. However, the brute stood quiet. He was now silent, and showed no disposition to do untoward things. "Well done!" Edmund called up to me. "You will be all right now." "I'm all right," I said, "unless he turns round and chews my feet. He's a tame beast. Don't be uneasy. Good bye." He reached up, and I managed to catch his hand. "Good luck," he said. "Good bye." As he went back to the dinghy, I could hear the click of the Astarte's windlass getting up the anchor. Our string of camels moved off across the sandhills, and I felt nervous, insecure, and very lonely. End of chapter 7.